I've always thought of my neighborhood as the perfect place to live. Quiet, friendly, the kind of place where everyone knows each other's name. But there's one house that stands out from the rest, not because it's unkempt or dilapidated, but because of who lives there. Mrs. Agnes Bell, our neighbor 2 doors down, has been a fixture in the community for as long as I can remember. She's well into her late 72s, and every wrinkle on her face seems to hold a story of bitterness. Her eyes are sharp, always watching, always judging. We never saw her smile, and her voice, when she chose to use it, was always curt, almost as if it hurt her to speak. I'd heard stories about her, of course. Everyone in the neighborhood had. Some said she'd lived alone for decades, ever since her husband died under mysterious circumstances. Others said she never really liked anyone, not even the kids who accidentally kicked their ball onto her lawn. But I never put much stock in those stories. After all, she was just an old woman, right? But that all changed last month. It started with small things. At first, I didn't even notice. A garden tool went missing from my shed. A few nights later, I found my trash can knocked over, garbage strewn across the driveway. I brushed it off as raccoons, or maybe even a prank by some local kids. But then I started noticing other things. Mrs. Bell was always outside no matter the time of day. She'd be there, standing at her window or sitting on her porch, staring. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but it was hard to ignore. I'd catch her eyes following me as I left for work, returned home, or even when I was just out mowing the lawn. The way she looked at me, cold, calculating, it was unnerving. One afternoon, as I was trimming the hedges, I felt her gaze again. I glanced up, and there she was, standing in her front yard, staring directly at me. Her lips curled into a sneer, and for a brief moment I felt a chill run down my spine. "Need something, Mrs. Bell?" I called out, trying to sound casual. She didn't respond, just kept staring. I turned back to my work, but I could still feel her eyes on me, boring into my back. I worked faster, eager to get inside. When I finally finished and turned around, she was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of Mrs. Bell. Why was she watching me? What did she want? I got up around midnight, deciding that a glass of water might help calm my nerves. As I passed by the window, something outside caught my eye. There, standing in the middle of my front yard, was Mrs. Bell. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at my house. My heart skipped a beat. Why was she here? I quickly turned off the lights and peeked through the blinds. She didn't move. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? An old woman standing in my yard wasn't exactly a crime. Still, something about her presence unsettled me deeply. After what felt like an eternity, she finally turned and walked back to her house, disappearing into the darkness. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The next morning, I found footprints in the dew-covered grass where she had stood. A few days later, I decided I'd had enough. I was tired of feeling uneasy in my own home, so I decided to confront her. I marched over to her house and knocked on the door. It creaked open on its own, revealing a dark hallway. "Mrs. Bell?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. No answer. I stepped inside, the musty smell of old wood and dust filling my nostrils. The house was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I ventured further in, calling her name again, but still, no response. As I moved through the house, I noticed how sparse and cold it was. There were no personal touches, no family photos, no signs of a life lived, just bare walls and old furniture. I reached the living room, and that's when I saw it, a table. I reached the living room, and that's when I saw it, a table covered in newspaper clippings. My heart raced as I scanned the headlines. Man found dead in home, foul play suspected. Neighbor's disappearance baffles police. Mysterious deaths plague community. All the articles were about people in the neighborhood. And there, in the middle of the table, was a knife. Old, rusted, but unmistakably sharp. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a floorboard creaking. I whipped around to see Mrs. Bell standing in the doorway, her eyes cold and piercing. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and threatening. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is this?" I stammered, gesturing to the table. She took a step closer, her expression darkening. "They were nosy, just like you," she hissed. "They couldn't leave well enough alone." Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, barreling out of the house and back to the safety of my own. I locked the door behind me, my hands shaking. I called the police, reporting what I had seen. But when they arrived, Mrs. Bell's house was empty. The clippings, the knife, everything was gone. The officers searched the place, but found nothing. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. Every noise, every creak of the house made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me, waiting for the right moment. One evening, as I was leaving for work, I noticed something strange on my porch. A small, neatly wrapped package with no return address. My hands trembled as I picked it up, dread pooling in my stomach. I opened it slowly, revealing an old photograph inside. It was a picture of me, taken from outside my window while I was sleeping. That night, I didn't go home. I drove around aimlessly, too afraid to return. When I finally did, it was early morning, and the neighborhood was just beginning to stir. But something was different. Mrs. Bell's house, which had always been dark and foreboding, now had its front door wide open. I approached cautiously, peering inside. The house was empty, completely empty, as if no one had lived there for years. No furniture, no sign of life, just bare walls and dust-covered floors. The police were called again, and they searched the house thoroughly. This time they found something, an old rotting wooden floorboard in the living room, pried loose. Beneath it, buried deep in the earth, were the remains of several bodies. The bodies of people who had gone missing over the years, their faces still twisted in terror. Mrs. Bell was never found. It's been months since then, but I still can't shake the feeling that she's out there, watching, waiting. I moved out of that neighborhood, far away, but the nightmares follow me. Every night I dream of her standing at my window, staring, her eyes cold and unblinking. They say she was just a lonely old woman, that she couldn't have done the things I saw. But I know the truth, and now so do you. If you ever find yourself in a quiet neighborhood, and you notice an old woman watching you from her window, leave. Don't ask questions, don't get curious. Just leave, before it's too late.